This means for public health is Dr. Jane Morgan. She is Executive Director of Piedmont Healthcare's COVID Task Force. Piedmont Healthcare located right here in Atlanta. Good morning. Thank you so much for coming on in. I don't know, that kind of not surprises me, but it concerns me. If we don't have a centralized system now that requires health agencies and hospitals to report tests, COVID tests. Are you concerned about that?
You know, you're absolutely correct. And what has happened is when the public health emergency ends, that means that CDC's authority to require that reporting mechanism from laboratories, hospitals, and other entities also ends. And it's really a state-by-state response after that. And so it becomes very fractured. And we have to remember that the CDC really was built for identification, monitoring, surveillance, and not really for mass response to operationalizing in an emergency situation.
If they were built for surveillance, why isn't there a central system for surveilling outbreaks or potential outbreaks?
Exactly, and there is, but it's very fractured. So they use multiple sources from multiple vehicles, and that really works when time is a luxury for you, when you have the time to do it. But as we see in a pandemic and an emergency response, it really doesn't work. You have to have something that's more streamlined.
Just because the public health emergency is over, it doesn't mean that the risk of another COVID variant popping up or another outbreak is over, right?
You know what, that is absolutely true, and that's a really good point to make. And one thing that will continue is the genomic surveillance will continue under the CDC. We have to remember that this is in an endemic state, which means it is still around us. People are still contracting COVID. We still have hospitalized patients with COVID, even with these Omicron variants. And we have to always be on the lookout for what that next variant may or may not be. We've been very lucky in many ways with this entire Omicron family of variants, but we really don't know. The virus isn't consulting us, and so hopefully it will stay in a very low-level state.
So, Doctor, what were some lessons learned from this pandemic, and what should be applied? Which lessons should be applied?
Yeah, you know, one of the really unexpected, unintended lessons learned is that clinical trials really ramped up in the COVID space as the companies that really were investigating vaccines and other COVID therapeutics really ramped up, and they began to aggressively enroll minority patients into these trials, where by and large, populations of color have been left out of clinical trials. And so when we get FDA approvals, it's unclear whether these devices or drugs are relevant to all populations. Suddenly, during the pandemic, we saw these companies actually pursuing populations and developing relationships. The other thing that we see in the middle of the public health emergency is that there are more touch points for populations of color with the healthcare system, especially with regard to access. And it went a long way to decrease the health equity gap. And so that was an unintended consequence, which unfortunately will also perhaps in some ways end. But we would like to see the pharmaceutical and device companies continue to enroll patients of all nationalities and colors into clinical trials.
I remember going into communities in Alabama to report on the vaccine inequity. And so, and also we learned during the pandemic how COVID hit certain communities harder than others, right? Do you think those lessons now are being applied, or at least more focus on certain demographics when it comes to certain diseases?
And I think we really have seen not only how fractured is our public health system, but how fractured is our overall medical system, and with the disparate levels of care that you receive in this country, and how access really matters. And so absolutely, those lessons were glaringly apparent within the pandemic, and we will be transferring those lessons to see how can we continue to improve to have greater health care for everyone.
We have 5 seconds. Are we aptly prepared? Is our public health system aptly prepared for the next potential pandemic?
And so I think we are not prepared, and hopefully we will get the funding that we need to shore up our defenses and streamline our digital preparedness to make certain that communication is effective and we can get the information that we need to warn the public.
What an important conversation. Dr. Jane Morgan, thank you so much for coming in. Appreciate it.
Thank you.